let's talk a little bit about Vlad Guerrero Jr. and the Pete Alonso impact of that deal that he signed, because this was obviously the biggest news, or one of the biggest stories to come out over the past week. So he got a 14-year, $500 million extension with the Blue Jays. It doesn't seem like the Mets were ever going to pay that type of money for Vlad. But Hannah, how do you think this does affect Pete Alonso's contract? Obviously, Pete is a little older than Vlad. The situations are different, but how do you think that impacts him at all?
I don't know that it impacts him all that much. It can only help him, certainly, to sort of raise the overall first base market. But this felt, frankly, like an overpay by a front office that needed a win and saw a really impactful and almost obvious win in retaining their homegrown star and a guy who's a really, really good player. Certainly, it's not that he doesn't deserve the money. It's just that the leverage was certainly with Vlad. And in fact, I was surprised this deal got done when it did, because it seemed like, well, at this point, he's just going to test the market. Why not? He's gotten so close, and they passed his imposed deadline. But obviously, the Blue Jays were willing to do kind of whatever it took to get this deal done. And that's not something that the Mets are ever going to do with Pete Alonso. We saw that last year. They're not going to do, like, they not only did they give him the $500 million, but like $375 million of it is in bonuses, which is not taxed and not subject to proration if there is missed games in 2027 or a lockout. So they were motivated to get this done with this one particular guy. And so it's hard to see a situation based on what happened this last offseason. We already know the Mets are not going to take that kind of mentality into negotiating with Pete. And they're the only team that would have that mentality of like, we got to get it done with this one particular guy. I will say that I think Pete is helping his market with his own production. That probably goes further than anything that happened with Vlad Guerrero Jr. Pete's looking great. He's performing well. He's off to a much better year than he was last year. And that's what he can do to kind of affect his market. And in some ways that's better because he can control that himself. And the age thing is always going to be against him, sort of in comparison to Vlad. But if he can show that he is as impactful an offensive player, that'll help his market.
Yeah, I mean, so far he's showing that. It does seem like he's playing with a little more freedom. He's not really feeling the pressure as much either. But Will, do you see a scenario where the Mets do extend Pete mid-season or after the season before his contract expires, especially if he continues to perform at this level?
I wouldn't rule it out, but I also have not heard anything that makes me think that will happen. So I want to be careful to say like, oh, no, it's not going to happen. And, it's just something that I don't really know about. But I haven't really heard anything that would make me think that that's on the track to happen. I think people forget that sometimes that Scott Boras is Pete Alonso's agent, and not that Scott Boras never does extensions. They're a little bit on the rare side, but he has done them in some ways. With Matt Chapman was a good example last year, even with the San Francisco Giants, and that happened late into the season after a free agency that didn't go the way that people thought. But Matt Chapman is a different player than Pete Alonso. Matt Chapman is a premier defensive player, somebody that is not a first baseman, and so I don't think that Pete Alonso's market necessarily changes all that much, just because unfortunately he was probably born in the wrong time for this, because, years ago, a big first baseman, power hitting first baseman, it didn't really matter if he was 29, 30, 31, he was going to get paid. And these days it's just not the same. So he's still facing those same question marks as he did last offseason of, hey, this guy's going to be on the wrong side of 30 years old. He plays first base. I will say, though, that I think defensively he does not get as much credit as he deserves. I know he doesn't have as much range as some of these other guys do, and he may never have that, but he does a really good job of scooping balls out of the dirt. He does some other things that the Mets infielders will be quick to tell you saves them a bunch. So I think I'm with Hannah 100%. I nodded my head throughout everything that she said, just because the biggest part of this for Pete Alonso is Pete Alonso has to produce the way Pete Alonso is capable of producing. And if he does that, the market for Pete Alonso will be a lot better than whatever it was last offseason. And that's something that he can handle. And that is something that he is showing us he's ready to do in 2025.